Hey, welcome back. It's Rent Control Radio, episode 4, and we have come to the end of the Minneapolis Rent Stabilization Working Group process. When we started recording these episodes in the summer, we were committed to following this process. So just a quick overview. The city appointed a working group. This was mostly landlords, representatives of developers, and a few renters sprinkled in, convened over the last couple months and debated what type of rent control policy should they recommend that the city of Minneapolis passes. We're here today on this show covering the final 2 meetings of that working group and the recommendations, the actual result of this working group. So let's just go through it meeting by meeting. So I think one of my esteemed colleagues, Isaac and Deanna, attended both of these meetings. I forgot which one was which. So let's talk about the second to last meeting. If one of you want to pick it up and kind of walk us through what happened in that.
Okay, today was the first day for voting on policy frameworks. 2 frameworks, number 5 and 7, were the most popular, with an almost even split between work group members. Majority property owners, bankers, and nonprofit housing providers voted for framework number 7, while majority tenant advocates and renters voted for framework number 5. Before voting, there was an approximate hour-long activity designed to go through each proposed policy framework, totaling 10 frameworks. NAO restructured the previous 5 small groups to 3 large groups for this activity. Each facilitator formatted the activity to gauge work group members' opinions on their perceived positive and negative consequences of each framework proposal. So that was the first day of voting, and then the second day of voting was December 13th, 2022.
Yeah, so second day of voting was the last meeting of the work group. And so the 2 frameworks that Deanna mentioned, framework 5 and 7, were very different frameworks. Framework 5, the core policy was a fixed rent increase at 3%, no adjustment for CPI, with vacancy control, no rent banking. There were no exemptions. There was an exception process for investment / substantial capital improvements, and then the compliancing part involved city certification and a appointed board for compliance and enforcement. After that last meeting's negotiating, they broke up into groups that supported 5 and 7, and Group 5 added appointed and elected members of the board. And then Framework 7, which was much more capital-minded, I'll say, involved variable rent increases starting at 3%, 5%, 7%, and 10%. I think they ended up on like a 5% to 7% range.
Yeah, I think so.
And then plus CPI adjustments, vacancy decontrol, rent banking, affordable housing exemption, exempting properties that are 4 units and less, exempting new construction. And then they talked about how long that new construction exemption should be, and I think they settled on 30 years. Exempting owner-occupied housing, and then compliance and monitoring, appeals, self-certifications, alternate dispute resolution. So very polar opposite
Yeah. Just a quick CPI means Consumer Price Index.
Yeah, so adjustment for inflation, basically. And in the last meeting, it was divvied up by, basically landlords and some nonprofit housing.
Yeah. So we have like, is there a list of how they sat at each table?
1 second.
Because I'm looking at a photo of it. So it's like, so the last meeting they were able to pick which table they could sit at.
They divided up by which framework they supported.
Right.
Yeah.
So they had agency.
Yeah,
at
they
the
had,
last
they had
meeting.
agency according to their preferred policy.
Yeah. So okay. So you have Cecil Smith. You have Bruce Brunner. I'm already like forgetting people's names.
So
Bruce Brunner, the triplex.
Framework 7, the more capital landlord friendly one, had consisted of 11 votes. This was the lower vote getter. Bruce Brunner, Kathy Capone Bennett,
Dan Larger.
Kelly Elkin,
Largan.
Dan Largan, Kayla
Eric.
Gibbons, Eric Myers, Henry Parker, Joe Paris, Cecil Smith,
My guy.
Sue Speakman Go. No, she was.
Yeah, I think she's
Ryan Taylor, who is the one.
Is that her?
I'm pretty sure she was with Framework 7.
Okay.
And then, so it was notable. There was one tenant advocate or tenant representative that was in agreement, was a major bootlicker, very much in agreement with all the landlords and developers.
He was always like super happy to talk to Cecil Smith.
Yeah.
Big bootlicker energy. I remember he
Yeah.
hushed me down that one time when I got into it with the guy. He was very upset with my participation in the meeting. If I'm thinking of the same guy.
Like glasses.
Short hair.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. He was very upset with me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised.
Why
by
was
that.
he there? Like, how did he get selected? I mean, how did any of these tenants get selected? But okay, anyway. So then Framework 5, people sitting there, the tenant advocates, Daniel Suter, Maura Brown,
Peggy Clark, Jimmy Lee Harris, Alex Kane, Jonathan Kim, Rico Morales, Yolanda
Kadra
Roth,
D.
Ellen Solly, Kim Smith Moore.
Did you say their name?
You said Dan. Asale
Asale
Sol
Sol,
Young,
yeah.
and Jose Zayas Caban, who wasn't there, but obviously voted in favor of Framework 5.
Yeah.
Via email.
Yeah, and it was like a exuberant moment. Definitely, there was like dozens of people from Minnesota United for Rent Control and what is the like nonprofit like
Home to Stay.
Turned out people, and so there was like maybe 40-ish people that were watching, and when Framework. When they tallied up the votes, because this was all done through this website, and I remember I want to say it was
Menti.com.
Eric Myers was concerned that like people in the audience were going to try to get on the website to like also vote in it, like they would.
This election was stolen.
Which was pretty farcical. But so they announced it through this GIF that popped up. It was like a celebration GIF, but it popped up for Framework 7, and then they had to like go to the computer and like check out what was happening, because it was obvious. You saw more people sitting at one table. You knew how the vote was going to go, but it popped up from the wrong one, and they're like, oh, sorry, we had set it to the framework that got less votes, like got this celebratory gift. And so they're like, they tallied it up, and they're like 12 votes for Framework 5 and 11 for Framework 7, and then we had 2 other votes from the people that aren't here, and they also voted for Framework 5. So it was like this drawn out thing to be like, okay, 14 to 11, 56% consensus for basically the same rent control policy that was on the ballot in St. Paul, from my understanding.
That's what it seems like. Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, I really appreciate you both for like sticking it out and going to all these meetings. It was kind of like partly my idea that got us into this mess, and then with my work schedule and my transportation, I kind of stopped going, and y'all had to go through it. But when I'm looking at this, I'm like thoroughly impressed with the people on the working group who made this happen. Like, this is a really strong rent control policy, no exemptions, a 3% cap. Coming into this, I didn't expect something this strong could come out of this working group, and they were fighting an uphill battle. I don't think this is what the facilitators wanted. Obviously, they tried to rig the
No.
vote, like so, yeah, they did it. But
Stop the steal.
yeah, right, stop the steal, exactly. But that's really great. It is. And this isn't a perfect policy. We could get into, maybe if we continue to do this coverage, we could get into like the exception that's there for capital investment into a building. But for the most part, this is as strong of a policy that we could ask for. So really, I tip my hat to the advocates who they had to do a lot of organizing. I'm sure a lot of the people who ended up voting for the strong rent control policy could have been organized towards Framework 7, towards the other the losing framework 7 that got 11 votes. It might as well not be a rent control policy. It's
Yeah.
really incredibly weak. They really are polar opposites in a lot of ways. So
Yeah.
I say salute. That's my biggest reflection, is like, this is a great outcome. And yeah, what's your reflections on it?
Yeah, it's like I'm like very surprised. Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I did not expect something with teeth to be like the consensus framework. There was a lot of like pushback at the end because they were wording it slippery and being like, both of these frameworks will be in the report. Both frameworks will be shown to city council. And Rico Morales and Asali Sol Young both were like really pushing heavily back on that. Like, this is the consensus framework. And like D'Angelo Svenkinson kept saying like, yeah, that'll be noted in the report. But it was still like, they're going to show all the intricacies, the vote breakdown. I'm sure they'll use that in their deliberations, and like all that excitement and happiness still was like put into reality like a few days later when Mayor Fry was like, it's not happening. We're not passing this framework. I'm going to veto it if it comes to my desk. So just putting it in perspective of like, this room has zero power in the real world at the end of the day, which is incredibly frustrating considering how much time and energy and resources that it sucked up for the past few months.
Yeah, 100%. I saw that too, and like, basically the struggle continues. It's like, I salute the people who decided, to go into that room and fight, and they were able to win that room. They were able to out organize their opponents, and they were able to get this strong framework put forward. And like you said, now the city council, we already know the math on the city council. There's a few really strong rent control advocates. There might be a few wishy-washy, and there's some strong rent control opponents, and Mayor Fry's veto is on the table, and the struggle continues. Now we're going to have to go out and keep organizing. It's going to mean getting renters involved. It's going to mean keeping up the fight. And it really is another chance, I think, to sharpen our consciousness, to recognize like, okay, the city created this process in order to like stifle the voices of renters who wanted us to pass a rent control policy. And when they didn't get the result that they wanted, that benefits the capitalist class, they already step in and use their veto power. So nothing that we didn't know. It's frustrating. That's the game we're playing. Deanna, you had a really good point before we started recording, and I think we already mentioned it, but you just want to like say that again for listeners?
Yeah. Just that like seeing these photos, and I want to like post them on the Patreon or something just so people can see with their own eyes how clearly it's defined by like property owners and land developers and bankers and real estate capital, etc. They are all at one table, plus this weird tenant dude, but just like this whole process just demonstrated how much like nonprofit housing developers do not care about poor people, that they're not advocates for poor people. They're advocates for land and like being capital holders. So it just became very clear to me, like, yeah, it's just a land project. It's just a property and capital project. It's like they're called nonprofits and you're supposed to like feel warm and fuzzy about that for some reason and give them your money, but they're just going to use it to like buy property and then like evict poor people if they can't pay the rent that month. So I just, yeah, that just felt really icky to me. Being in this room with these people and watching their arguments and how they continue to echo each other and echo Cecil Smith at the end of the day and like suck up to him when he was like the most egregious person in that room. Yeah, it just felt gross. So just like to be clear, like it was Aon and Common Bond representatives that are the housing nonprofit developers or landowners and landlords sitting at the table with like all the other landlords of different scales. And then another thing, I just like, this isn't, a personal thing. This is an observation of just like how Dan Largan, at the very beginning of this process, introduced himself as a small landlord, and like he's invested in his tenants and he wants them to have a dignified and quality housing. But he's still going with framework number 7 at the end of the day. Like he's not going to vote against his own interests, his employment, his how he is able to subsist. So I just get frustrated by the all shucks, like we're all in this together attitude when clearly people are not in this together.
Right. 100%. Hell yeah. Do you have any like closing reflections, Isaac, after going to all those meetings or as the process comes to a wrap?
I just want to put it in perspective of like what a couple days ago the city brutally evicted another encampment at the quarry. It was the longest standing encampment up until that point, and just an incredible show of force, dozens of squad cars, CRG, the like military contractors were seen on site as well. So just like,
wow,
how these things move in tandem. I think how there's no safety net for people to get evicted. There's no safety net for those rent increases to push people out. And then once you're on the streets, that doesn't stop.
Yeah.
Like it's a constant force that is always driving you down. And that's how the city has always operated at the end of the day. And that's what we're up against.
Yeah, it makes me fucking sick to think of. Yeah. One thing I thought that in this framework 5, the strong rent control framework that won the most votes, the consensus in this process, is that they also added a just cause tenant protections to the framework. So it's not just a rent control policy, but they were recognizing that, like we've said many times on this podcast, rent control is just the tip of the iceberg. It's a way to stop some of this violence. And then we need to change the housing system beyond that. And they talk about just cause tenant protections, which would make it harder for a landlord to evict. And then they upped the eviction notification to 45 days or more. I think now it's like 7 days or 14 days or something really completely inadequate. So I think that's like a good highlight of this policy. And then of course, my last reflections in that vein is like all of this is about decommodifying housing, is about taking our housing infrastructure, the buildings, the policy out of the hands of private capitalists who are profiting off of it and putting it back into the hands of the people, putting it into the public realm, making more public housing and protecting housing for its use value as shelter rather than as its investment value for the capitalist class. That's what it all boils down to. And I think this process was just another step in sharpening those contradictions. And again, I guess I will share one personal reflection because I wasn't on the last episode of the show, and you all kind of told the story of I got into it the last meeting I went to. I was sitting observing the meetings, and the guy from the Ryan companies was making his case against rent control, and he said, we can't. Why would anybody want to own a building if we make it harder for them to make money? I mean, I don't own any buildings. And I just interjected and said, you're here representing the Ryan companies, one of the largest building owners in the city. You can't say you don't own a building. And it turned into a back and forth. And I kind of like, it created a bit of a scene. And I left and I still think about it. It like really, it kind of fucked with me, because I was so angry at the time. And I felt like, I'm not going to get into all of that. but my reflection I do want to share is that it made me realize, like, I want to be at the table fighting. Like, I think it was good for us to be observing, and it was good to have people paying attention to the process who weren't on the working group. Like, to somewhat say, like, this working group shouldn't have all the legitimacy. You know what I'm saying? It was created by the city to slow us down. So to have some people who are setting outside of that, I think is good. But also, I respect the people who decided to show up and fight. You know, and it really made me have a gut check of, like, I'm passionate about this. I want to be at those tables. I want to be arguing. So I think in the future, I'm going to be more willing to actually be in these imperfect processes and actually trying to, like, fight through those imperfect processes and not always stay on the outside. So I just, like, tip my hat to the people who showed up and who got their hands dirty.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, like Rico Morales and Dan Suter and Jennifer Arnold, like I feel like they continuously showed up. Maura Brown, they showed up like every week. Yeah.
I got to shout out Jose too, who was on the show.
Yeah.
His statement that he sent in was strong. Well, cool, y'all. Hey, thanks for everybody who's been tuning in with us on Rent Control Radio. Thanks to Aaron West. Thanks to B. Rosas. Thanks to Sean Lim. Thanks to everybody behind the scenes. Who knows if we'll come back with another episode? You know, we got some internal meetings to do. This is our wrap up of the rent stabilization working group coverage. Stay tuned, because on the back half of this episode, we have an interview with Tram Huang, who's an amazing organizer and popular educator who led the campaign in St. Paul for rent control. It is now working for Policy Link, do some national rent control work. So she's going to walk us through some victories for rent control that have happened around the country. Happy New Year to everybody. Stay safe out there in the snow, and we'll see you in 2023.
Hey y'all, my name is Tim. I live in Powderhorn. I saw the sign for this project while I was walking home. I think it was last night. And today is November 5th, 2022. And yeah, I'm glad you're doing this. I think that we need publicly funded social housing of some kinds, and that the current system that we have is despicable. We should probably have a permanent moratorium on evictions. I'm currently paying for a $1,500 a month 2-bedroom apartment with my partner, and we are worried about how much we're paying for heat in the winter. I am constantly furious about the treatment of unhoused people in the cities and feel helpless to do anything because of the state violence that is used against them all the time. Yeah, had a lot of feelings. Don't like rambling, but I'm doing it. But yeah, thank you for doing this. Let's work towards the decommodification of housing and towards communism, where we don't have to worry about these things anymore. Thanks, y'all. Good night.
Hey, this is Cullen. I'm a renter in Southside Minneapolis, around like Whittier. I'm kind of new to Minneapolis, though. I'm from Portland originally. I'm on my break right now from work. I'm a cook and a dishwasher, and just want to say thanks for the hard work y'all do researching and going to these meetings. I've been to 2 now. I went with my comrade. I think you actually, Jake, met us, and I think I met some other people maybe taking notes. But yeah, it's kind of a shit show. It's hard. I can't imagine going to all the meetings y'all go to. So thanks, because it's good to know what all is going on, who these people are, so we can move more effectively against this settler dictatorship, because it's ridiculous. And I was wondering specifically about like tenant unions in the city, since I said I'm a little new here. I've been trying to look around and see what's going on. And I know IX exists and stuff. It seemed like more like a renters' rights group, and I was more wondering if there's like actual like tenants unions, or maybe I'm misunderstanding IX. But I don't know if you could all just maybe talk about that more on an episode. if there are like contemporary tenant struggles like going on, or maybe like past ones in the city that like people can kind of learn from, or just maybe around the country too. Or if there's no contemporary ones, maybe like y'all could, talk about like how one gets one started, or like what do you do? I've listened to a lot of podcasts where people talk about, getting a union started in your workplace, but getting a tenants union, like I honestly don't even know where I would start if I was doing that. And I think that would be really cool to like maybe talk about that. But I know like maybe that's not like what y'all want to like do with the pod, or like, I'm just wondering because I don't know what to do, and that's been on my mind a lot lately. And yeah, maybe y'all could talk a bit more about that, because I'm a firm believer the people are the motive force of history, and these people in this working group, like they need to be scared of renters, like they need to see that there's real force, because that's the only language they understand is force. It sucks, but that's what they've that's the type of struggle that they've pushed upon us. And I would love to see that policy by MIRAC put through, but I'm pretty pessimistic about that. But yeah, I just wanted to finish up and let you all know again that I really appreciate the work you do, and really appreciate the podcast. I know other people do. Other comrades of mine put me onto it when I moved here, and it's really been helpful getting a real lay of the land of like the material conditions of Minneapolis. And I think it's a real central like contradiction that you all are like analyzing on the podcast. Like land and property relations are really important to flush out for everyone. So thank you, and dare to struggle, dare to win. Yeah, thanks.
All right, hey Pete, you're tuned into Rent Control Radio, and I'm really glad to be joined by my friend and comrade Trom Huang, who's joining us today. Trom, listeners of the podcast will know Trom has been on our show before because Trom was a leader, the director, I think was the title, of the campaign, the successful ballot initiative that passed the original rent control policy in St. Paul. So Trom has been a teacher on this show before and a comrade. So we're going to touch on St. Paul briefly, but really we're going to talk to Trom today about some rent control struggles that are happening around the country. We've been really focused on what's happening locally, and I think it'll be fun to bring into the mix, hear what renters and advocates are fighting for around the country. So thanks for joining us, Trom.
Thanks for having me.
Hell yeah. When you look back at the organizing you did, the fight to win that ballot measure in St. Paul, what would you say are like some of your fond memories, like one or two of like of fond positive memories that stand out to you?
Yeah, there's so many, and there's some like really big picture ones, and then some like just moments in time that are kind of frozen. And one of the best ones for me was actually on election night. We were at the MNYC office, all gathered, kind of biting our fingernails, chain smoking, trying to figure out like what is going to happen. And we were getting results like precinct by precinct, and Ramsey County takes forever compared to Hennepin County. So, we're like, we have a press conference in 10 minutes, but there's nothing in. And we were getting precinct results back, and one of our canvassers who is a student at Macalester, shout out to Jonah, he was canvassing like all day and caught two people in this precinct. And he was like, are you all voting? And, they were like, yeah, we'll get to it. It was like 5:00. And he's like, no, you got to go now. And the result for that precinct came in, and Rent Control won that precinct by 1 vote.
That's amazing.
And that is just one of the most beautiful moments where like you tell people that every conversation matters and every vote matters, but they don't always get to see the consequences so concretely.
Hell yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah,
That's amazing. What about, before we turn our attention outside of the Twin Cities, what's one of the lessons? I'm sure there's tons of them, and we're going to be unpacking that campaign for a long time, I imagine. But I'm just curious, if is there one or two things that really stand out for you as far as an organizer or even as a person, that you feel like you learned through that struggle?
Yeah, I've done a lot of reflecting on that. And I think that actually talking to campaigns across the country and reflecting on what they've experienced has helped me process that too. Because, when you run a campaign like this in the Midwest, it can feel a little bit lonely.
Yeah,
So many states have state preemptions or, regulatory barriers that prevent people from doing this. And so being able to process this with other organizers around the country has been helpful. But I think one of the biggest learning points is actually like a tension that exists in rent stabilization and rent control campaigns, which is that they often are rooted in tenant organizing, but in order to win, you have to expand into the world of electoral organizing,
hmm
which, within electoral organizing, you have to shift your audience a little bit. Like you can't, um, the campaign team can't necessarily be looking through eviction records and door knocking to help people in court. Like the tactics and strategies that you use to support renters during tenant organizing campaigns are really different from the time that you have to dedicate to things that aren't always like the most fun. Like
yeah,
you
yeah,
gotta door knock in homeowner heavy neighborhoods because that's the
yeah.
reality of who votes based on the structural barriers in our electoral system. So
That's
um
real.
and I think that folks that are rooted in tenant organizing sometimes feel like they have to walk away from tenant organizing to win a campaign. And I mean, I think there's like balance, right? I think that when you go from winning like a tenant focused campaign that's like maybe building specific or neighborhood specific, the people you have to persuade, the people you have to move, it is different, right? It's different from
Yeah,
a citywide ballot. But I think that's been like a really good learning and something
yeah,
that we all have to think about as we like. It sounds fun. I mean, of course it's fun. It's also awful, right? But then you
right.
really have to think about the sacrifices you make in terms of how you want to spend every hour of your day.
Yeah, wow, thank you for that. That's rich, and it brings up a lot of important questions as far as organization and organizational form. How do we build political vehicles that can do both of those types of campaigns and do them well, so that the tenant organizing can be sustained while the electoral campaigns are waged, and then the electoral campaigns can be successful but don't become unmoored from the tenant organizing, and like how are leaders developed in both of those spaces? How are the lessons passed back and forth? That's like, yes, stuff I've been chewing on too. And I'm sure a lot of other people in the Twin Cities too. So that's exciting. Okay, cool. Like I said, we just wanted to touch on that St. Paul experience. We're going to talk more about it in the future. Now, Trom, would you take us on a tour, please? First, I want to say, could you tell us a little bit about your new role? Like, what's the organization that you're working for? And then maybe launch into one of these rent control campaigns that's bubbling around the country.
Yeah, happy to. So I am now at a national organization. It's called Policy Link. It's actually based in Oakland, but we've got folks around the country, and we are a racial equity, policy advocacy and research organization. So we've got folks who are working on policy ranging from, myself on the housing team. I have a badass boss whose name is Rashida Phillips. She's like an Afrofuturist and like kick-ass housing lawyer. I've got like a great team at Policy Link that focuses on housing and various other policy. And we also have this really cool tool called the National Equity Atlas that folks can use for data. But so in my role there, I have been able to kind of use what I've learned and share what I've learned from the fight in St. Paul, because it can feel isolating to run a rent control campaign. And I think what I've picked up from talking to other people is that we're facing the same opposition, right? It's one big machine. It's the real estate lobby. They use the same tactics. They're not necessarily creative. And if, when there are one or two or three or a dozen campaigns that are able to figure out how to beat them, then we should all be following those strategies and mimicking those tactics. So that's what my job entails.
Dope.
And
Awesome.
yeah, and so through that work, I've been able to actually meet with some incredible organizers. Most of the ones that I'm going to name like really ran these campaigns like on their own without our support. Like we really learned about them afterwards and are really
Right.
celebrating them.
Cool.
But yeah, it really is a tour around the country because I
Nice.
want to touch on like West Coast, East Coast, and the South, which
Love it.
doesn't always happen with rent control. I think rent control, we think of like, oh, it's always California, or
Right.
like when it happened in St. Paul, people are like, oh, we're the first in the Midwest, and things are really opening up. Like people want it everywhere.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I mean, like, and it's so important. I think obviously we're running these fights where we have to and where we can, right, at different levels of government, at the municipal governments and state governments, but we can't lose sight of the fact that like there should be a national rent control policy. It's so hard to think about like federal national politics, but that's why I'm excited to have this conversation. Tell me where are we going on our tour first, so I can get myself properly situated.
Yeah, well, since it just snowed a bunch here, we're gonna go to sunny LA first.
Okay, bet. So here we
Um,
go. I'm putting on my ice cube. I'm what am I doing? I'm rolling up some nice tree. I'm just getting the sunshine. I'm getting like a nice vegan smoothie or maybe some good street tacos or something. Here we are at LA. Let's go.
Yeah. So here we're in LA, landed in LAX. We're actually gonna go to Pasadena because that's like the only
Okay.
reason. That's the only way that people like can relate to figure out where Pasadena is. So we landed in LAX. We're actually going to Pasadena, which
Okay.
borders LA, but also like 3 other cities. So it's kind of a small community. And it's small, but I'm pretty sure its population is like the size of St. Paul, actually. So small in relation
Oh,
to
wow.
LA, but still like
Right.
significant.
And I
And
remember I've
so
never been there, but LA is like a sprawling metropolis, right? A lot of different cities and suburbs that make up this huge, and Pasadena fits inside of that big LA metro.
Yep. Yeah, you'd probably
Okay.
drive into Pasadena and not realize it. You'd probably like, I'm still in LA.
Okay, cool.
And that was actually one of the challenges they had with getting signatures. Some people were like, well, I'm like a block away, but my address says Pasadena. And then it like didn't count because they didn't actually live in Pasadena.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. But Pasadena is a really great story. So their campaign for both rent control and just cause. So they put both into one. And it's kind of the perfect pairing, right? Because with rent control, you can't economically evict someone, but then the loophole is that, well, you can just like no cause evict them. And so Pasadena passed this perfect package that was like, not only can you not no cause evict, you also can't economically evict. So that's
Awesome.
kind of like model policy. And it was led by the Pasadena Tenants Union. And they ran a campaign that involved collecting like over 15,000 signatures. And well, over 15,000 valid signatures. They had to collect a lot more
Right.
to get there. And then they got it on the ballot in just recent summer, and then it
Okay.
passed by 55% just last month.
Oh,
on election
great.
day.
Hell yeah, that's awesome. And do you know what the terms of the rent control portion of the policy, like what type of policy it in the details?
Yeah. So Pasadena's annual rent cap is 75% of CPI. So
Okay.
75% of inflation. So,
Okay.
in years where inflation's really like normal, when it's like 2 or 3%, that'll be a really strong policy because that means rent is going to be capped like below St. Paul's, right? Below 3%.
Right.
And then when there are some difficult years with high inflation, it'll be a little bit tougher.
Right.
But yeah, 75% of CPI is kind of a trend that we're seeing in the past few years. A lot
Okay.
of cities had started with CPI caps. They were like, that's like a pretty good measure. It's like a pretty low number. And then with the recent economic crisis and inflation rising, a lot of cities have actually gone back and through the ballot or city council amended their cap to strengthen it. So now it's like
Okay.
instead of CPI, it's 60% of CPI, or like 80% of CPI or 3%, whichever is lower. So I think folks are
Interesting.
realizing that, yeah, and I think it's really powerful because it's not only normalizing the power of rent control, but it's also normalizing this idea that just having rent control isn't enough. It has to be a number that people can actually live with.
Yeah, cool. That's great. That's great. Do you know, are they in terms of like implementation and like the reaction from the landlord lobby? Like obviously what we saw here was renters, working class people, advocates getting these big victories, and then of course the battle continues, and the landlords and their lobbyists are able to claw back a little bit. Do you have any sense of kind of the next step for Pasadena? Do you think they'll be able to like implement things, or is it still, I imagine they're still in a big fight, really?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about California is that they have the Costa-Hawkins Act of 1995, which the state legislature passed in 1995, that was really favoring landlords,
Right.
and it significantly weakened any policy that would be passed in the future. And so in some ways, the landlords, I mean, they did lose this battle, right? Voters voted for rent control. But because they were able to get Costa-Hawkins passed back in the day, the full extent of Pasadena's rent control ordinance it won't be fulfilled, I guess, because Costa-Hawkins still exempts all housing that was built after 1995. Like, it's not even a rolling exemption. It's just like any building built after 1995 can't be rent controlled. Any rent control policy that a city passes has to have vacancy decontrol. And it exempts like all single family homes from rent control. And so any policy in California that's passed, like Costa-Hawkins is still the bar. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for that. I mean, and then again, this is like for us in Minnesota to, other people are dealing with these same issues, like the overlapping jurisdiction between the state government and the local government, and, landlords fighting for these exemptions. So a big salute to the people of Pasadena. And we'll link for folks listening to these organizations so that people can like pick up these threads. We're just going to touch on them quickly today. Okay. So, I've smoked enough weed. I've ate enough tacos. I've seen the beach enough. Where are we headed to next?
We're going to Disney World.
Yes. Actually, I'm okay. I'll send my nieces. They're big fans. So Disney World is
in Orange County, Florida.
Okay. That is not where I expected us to go.
I know, right? That's why it comes to mind every time I mean, not because I don't think there's amazing organizing happening in Florida, because we know there is, but the political, like the toxic political environment and So it was really amazing to hear like rent control come out of Orange County, Florida. So that's like home to Orlando.
Okay, cool. Tell us about it. Is there any significant features, or give us a little bit more of a window into what they did in Florida?
Yeah, so this one is tough. This one is one that is still kind of being fought in the courts. Essentially what happened was there was a lot of organizing done by Florida Rising. That's one of the leading groups of the campaign. And they pushed county commissioners in Orange County to declare it was like a form of declaring a housing emergency so that the county could enact rent control.
Wow. Cool. Yeah, that's something like, again, like a real theme, and not just in these housing struggles, but like I'm in a spot right now where I'm really taking a step back from going hard for like a decade, on like mostly on housing, but general organizing in the working class, and this issue of like jurisdiction and the county, especially if Orange County, if it contains Orlando, that's a big city, what I'm saying, with a lot of interest, and the power of organizations like Disney, and obviously Florida is a big city, state for real estate. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting that it was fought at the county level, and they had to do that type of a trick to like get this state of emergency declared in order to move a policy. Could you tell us a little bit about Florida Rising?
I actually don't know a ton about them. I know that they do a lot of organizing with labor groups and housing and tenant organizing. They're kind of a powerhouse that focused on this campaign this year.
Cool.
And the really tough thing about it is that they had like the highest margin of victory. When we look at ballot initiatives for rent control across the US this year, they had the highest margin of victory. It was 59% of voters voted for rent control.
Wow. Yeah, I mean that's a solid victory in the realm of electoral politics, especially for something that's obviously going to bring out the reactionary so hard, like rent control. So they won their ballot amendment, and now they are tied up in a legal battle.
Yeah. So what happened was that they the county commissioners put it on the ballot, and then there was essentially a lawsuit. The landlord said, you didn't do enough, or you didn't pass the threshold of what you needed to do to like outline the reasons for an actual like housing state of emergency.
Okay.
And so they're saying like what you did wasn't enough to announce a state of emergency, therefore you don't actually have the authority to enact rent control. While that was happening, folks still went ahead to put on the ballot, ballots got printed. And so what was really chaotic about election day is that what folks were being told is like, still vote, we just don't know if your vote will count right now. And then after election day, after folks found out that 59% of voters voted yes, I think the landlords appealed, and it actually like made it to a higher court. And so they couldn't change the ballots before people started voting, and so people still voted, but now it's stuck in the courts, and they're trying to figure out. The nice thing is that the county is actually like fighting this. You think about how St. Paul City Council chose not to defend safe housing.
Right.
Like, that was a pretty cowardly move. But the county commissioners in Orange County are actually like they're putting themselves out there, and they're trying to use their legal resources to actually fight this.
Hell yeah, that's what's up. That's what's up. And that goes back to like, I feel like the lesson that you pulled from the St. Paul campaign as far as like the place of electoral organizing alongside tenant organizing. So you get this sticky situation where you're mobilizing people to vote, knowing that it might not even be legal, or knowing that it might not come to fruition, but still, as organizers, that's a way to build political organization. It's a way to build political consciousness, even if you lose in the courts. And that's it's tricky, it's difficult, but there's potential there, and it has to be faced. I think it would be easy to say, voting doesn't, that age old argument of like voting's a waste of time. And people could make that argument, but I tend to like, line up on the side that it's a part of the process, and it's a field of struggle, obviously, so it'll be interested. This is my first time hearing about this fight in Florida, so I feel like I'm definitely going to tune into this now and see how it unfolds from there.
I think even the ballot measures that fail, either they don't get enough percentage of votes, or this litigation stuff happens. I think the fact that like Orange County residents can look around and be like, yeah, 60% of my neighbors
right
like want to protect me is huge. And I feel like
hell yeah,
just that political statement, right? That statement of unity across community is so important.
Yeah, and I think the same thing with here is like, it sharpens the class contradictions. People realize like, wow, renters deserve these protections. There's renters all across the country fighting for it. And you get these same people stepping in and undermining the democratic process to try to take your rights away. That's that can elevate political consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, once we know who our villains are.
Afraid of alligators, and I'm sick of the Florida heat. Where are we going for the last stop of our tour?
We're going to go to Portland, Maine.
Okay.
So way up there.
Nice.
Way up there.
Portland, Maine. I've met a guy from Portland, Maine. He was a barista at a local coffee shop. I picture like a real artsy kind of vibe in Portland, Maine. I don't know why I see Birkenstocks on my feet. I'm not sure if that's how they dress, but I'm imagining I'm wearing like Birkenstocks and like a comfy flannel, perhaps.
I feel like that's like both Portlands are
yes,
both
exactly.
Birkenstocks. Yeah, and flannel. That tracks.
All right, tell us about Portland, Maine.
Yeah, so Portland, Maine, their campaigns, they've actually had 2 rent control campaigns. So their campaigns have been led by the Maine Democratic Socialists of America chapter. So Maine DSA, yeah, they started this movement called People First Portland. And this was started around 2020. What they did was they wanted to push for a slate of progressive reforms that would help them build like a wide coalition. And so rather than just talking about housing issues, they also addressed minimum wage. They wanted to propose like a local Green New Deal ordinance. They wanted more tenant protections. And so their idea was, we might not have as much organizing power if we are like issue focused. So we're going to be a little bit cross issue in what we pass, so that we can, like you said, kind of build that unity across issues and really just build that class consciousness. And so in 2020, they put like 4 things on the ballot. actually I think 5. They had like an increased minimum wage for Portland, Maine. They wanted to ban like facial surveillance, wanted to pass a local Green New Deal, and then rent stabilization, and then like short-term rental regulations, because that's something that's like really big in Portland.
Okay, that means like Airbnb and those types of, that's a short-term
yeah, like
rental.
Vrbo stuff, yeah.
Right. Okay.
So 4 of those 5 policies passed.
Awesome.
And Portland kind of laid low. Like, I wish there was more news about it, because that was in 2020, and I guess we're all busy, with pandemic stuff. But
Right.
yeah, they passed it in 2020. That should have been uplifted as like a key victory across the country, because
Yeah,
I didn't
sounds
know
like
about
it.
it
Me neither.
until
Yeah.
recently.
I feel like it's tickling something in the back of my mind. Like maybe I've heard mention of it, but this really, I wouldn't have spoke on it if somebody asked me about it. Yeah, that's incredible, especially to think that they won 4 victories. You know what I'm saying? It seems like a great, exciting, like strategic approach.
Yeah, so they were able to get labor involved, and just folks that wouldn't necessarily be like, yeah, I'm down for a rent control campaign.
Yeah.
So they passed rent control in 2020, and it was based on inflation. And in 2021, as things were progressing, I think what they saw was that people were seeing rent increases that were, 7, 8, 9, 10% because of what inflation was,
Right.
and because of what inflation is still. And so, they came back to the voters and they said, let's strengthen this. Let's decrease the cap to, I want to say 70% of CPI.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's now 70% of CPI. And they also wanted to strengthen a few other tenant protections, like limiting security deposits and things like that. So put that back on the ballot. And it also won.
Wow.
And so
Hell yeah.
I think it's really amazing to see like people not just turn out for rent control the first time, but show up for it again, despite the constant narratives that are being told by the opposition. Just like, oh, this is gonna, destroy the housing market, and this is gonna, take housing out of our supply and whatnot. So I think what Portland, Maine showed is that those threats and those lies from the opposition are exactly what they are, right? Just threats and lies. And rent control can bring a lot of benefit to people, which is why they voted to strengthen it.
Right. Yeah, and it seems to me like to come back again the following year and vote to strengthen it sets a great precedent, because rent control is a living policy. It's not something that gets passed once and it's automatic. Like, it has to be implemented. So there's different mechanisms, and I'm not sure what the mechanism is in Portland, Maine, but just the fact that they have an electorate that's engaged enough that they're engaging with the policy, they're amending the policy, they're coming out. That seems like the type of momentum and the type of living campaign that like would breed a successful rent control policy. Because that's what we're talking about here. It's not like city council just votes one time and then things are over. It's a new way of engaging with politics, with the state. So that's really cool.
Yeah, the work in Portland was really cool.
Hell yeah, cool. Well,
and DSA led too.
DSA, exactly. I love to hear that. I really love to hear that. Well, I really appreciate this quick little tour. And the one other thing I wanted to ask you about is I encountered this report that your organization, Policy Link, put together with the Center for Popular Democracy and the Right to the City Alliance, probably in like 2019. And it really lit me on fire. And I've tried to spread it around to as many people as I can. We've hosted some workshops around this study. It's called Our Homes, Our Future: How Rent Control Can Build Stable, Healthy Communities. And just before we hop off, I wanted to see if you could lift up anything about that report. I'm going to link it for people, but what stands out to you for that? And what do you think is like the strength of that, I guess?
Yeah, there's a lot that I like about this report. It's like over 50 pages, so I'm gonna try to.
It's
a lot. It's good though. It's like actually one of the documents that I always come back to. I came back to it constantly throughout the campaign, because it's got so many good nuggets, not just of like data and facts, but also like messaging and talking points. Right. So highly recommend folks looking at that. But I guess one of the biggest things for me is, in the housing world, we're always talking about all these solutions that we need, because it's true. Like our housing system was kind of like a death by 1,000 paper cuts. So we just need like 1,000 policies to make up for all those harms. And so it can get easy. It's easy to like, get lost in that, right? It's easy to get lost in, we need these 20 things. We can focus on these protections first, and then we'll get to rent stabilization or rent control eventually when it's more politically palatable. And I think, that's like the wrong way to approach it, right? What's easy to win probably isn't impactful enough because it means that the opposition is willing to give it up, right? And what we really want to win are the policies that the opposition is going to fight us the hardest on, because we know that that's going to be the most like interference in the way that they operate and do business, which is extracting wealth from our communities and displacing people. And so I think related to that, like in the report, there is a piece about how rent control is the most immediate solution to address our affordability crisis. And I think that urgency is really important to lift up, because we think about like, oh, we need like more money to build more housing. Like, how long does that take, right? We need, it just, all of these policies can often feel so piecemeal. And I think the really cool thing to lift up about rent control is that there's speed, there's scale, and it's cost effective. Because no other policy, very few policies you can say, once we vote for it on November 2nd, it'll be active November 3rd. Or even when you think about California's statewide rent control bill, like it was retroactive for like 6 months, right? So going back in time. Not many policies can do that. I think the scale is incredible too, because if you build an ideal rent control policy, it covers everyone. And very few housing policies can actually impact everyone. And then it's cost effective. Like it's a rule that people have to follow. We are not trying to build like $500,000 housing units out there, which, we need to do that because we need more deeply affordable housing. But in the meantime, like how are people going to stay in their community? So I think those are like three of the things that I like to uplift about rent control, is that the urgency is there, and rent control as a policy is set up really well to like address that urgent need.
Yeah, awesome. I couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks so much for joining us, Trom, taking on this tour. We'll link to all these organizations, and wishing you the very best in the new year.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. All right. I'll see you, Trom.
Dear Rent Control Radio friends, thank you for covering all the small things, as well as the big context, around the local struggle against these greedy fucking landlords. The voicemail from the so-called small landlord you played in Rent Control Radio number 3 actually made some good points. I especially like that in addition to pointing out how the government could provide free, truly public housing if it chose to, she also raised the prospect of giving out free food. Mrs. I'm a Democrat may not have realized there is already a program for this, which only requires a couple trustworthy friends and a small amount of risk. This program is called shoplifting. Many a group has been fed as the result of one person walking out of a big box grocery store with a cart full of items. One accomplice watches for security and another provides help loading the car. When the rent is too damn high, this program can help a great deal. On another topic, you mentioned correctly that the true fight manifests not in boring meetings with loser developers, but in the streets. CPED, the city's so-called Community Planning and Economic Development Department, has spent many resources this year attempting to dismantle and destroy unhoused encampments and the people living in them, rather than using their staff time to hold landlords to account. In response, earlier this year, friendly neighbors found some amount of success delaying, dulling the violence, and occasionally preventing these encampment evictions through covert actions and retaliation such as the firebombing of trucks used to trash people's belongings, and other nighttime activities targeted at complicit city officials. These surprises let them know the people care, and forced the city to resort this fall to massive militarized raids of 100+ police officers and dozens of public works personnel to carry out their terror campaign. Unfortunately, the number of people willing to take such risks to defend the poor is small. In the absence of equally powerful above-ground campaigns to end encampment evictions, neighbors struggling to defend encampments spend most of their time replacing survival supplies until the next raid. While the perpetrators of violence have not felt enough heat to force them to fundamentally change their behavior. In contrast, the Minneapolis United for Rent Control campaign has a highly visible public face and active organizing group, but, as far as I know, though perhaps I am wrong, there has not been an appropriate level of covert action against the parasite, landlord class. What What if we were able to decimate the ranks of the landlords in the same way the Minneapolis PD has had its ranks slashed not through defund activism, but through creating an appropriately hostile environment to be a police officer? What if landlords and developers had to consider the risks to their own property, and the flammability thereof, when attending these dog and pony rent control working group meetings? Many of us dream of strong above-ground and covert actions working in tandem, and unhoused and renters struggle joining together to challenge the elites of this parasitic city in a very material way. Anyway, to any small landlords listening, I would simply say, work sucks. I know. If being a landlord while respecting everyone's human right to shelter is too difficult for you, might I suggest learning to code, selling crafts on Etsy, or perhaps moving back in with your parents. You could also try that cool shoplifting trick I mentioned earlier, if you are having trouble making ends meet. Thank you, Rent Control Radio. Always, I know you'll be at my show. Let's smash these fucking parasites. Hell. Yeah.